Welcome to session 6. In this session, we're connecting a lot of the topics that we've been previously discussing. The shamanism is a great bridge for us to establish where this all began. And in our Gnosticism talk and our celestial hierarchy talk, we saw what religion forms into later. So although this topic definitely isn't as popular as some of the others, it is necessary in order to bridge the topics that we've been talking about. This being the transition from animism into full-blown paganism. So it might seem mundane to us to just say the Canaanite polytheism. How can we relate to this? However, this particular polytheism has affected more than we would first assume. So first, I need to say that the Canaanites were the pre-Israelites. They inhabited Israel before Hebrew really took towards the world. This is where Judaism comes from, is from the Canaanites. In this way, too, this religion that we're discussing is not exclusive to the Canaanites. This would also have been the same worship of the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians. Everything that I'm discussing as well is analogous or translatable to the gods of Sumeria, to the gods of Egypt, and as we'll see, would be an inspiration for the Greek pantheon. Something that we're going to have to discuss at some point, I hope I come back to it, is that usually this particular religion is very demonized by the early church and so forth, with claims of child sacrifice. So we can approach it assuming that this is propaganda, that they would very much like to discourage anything that would tie them to this. But we can also approach it that maybe the winners of history have changed the story. So we're going to try to approach this topic as unbiased as we can, and just get down to what we can call the facts. So I think it's prudent to first establish all the analogous archetypes of early pagan beliefs. And what I mean by this is we have a king of the pantheon. This is a trope of paganism. We have a king. We have the Lord of the skies or the heavens, or most topically, a god of time that is represented by the planet Saturn. In Sumerian, this is Anu, which is where we're later going to discuss the word Anunnaki. In our discussion of Phoenician or of Canaanite, or what we can call Semitic pantheon, this is El, or Yahweh, which you can kind of already see where this is going. And if, of course, in the Greek pantheon, this would be Kronos, the god of time, or the first leader. Similarly, we have the god of wind and storms. This, as we already know, would be Zeus of the Greek pantheon. In Sumer, it would be Enlil. And then in our Semitic, it's going to be Baal, or Baal, which we're going to discuss him a lot, along with El. And then we have the god of waters and the god of wisdom. So this one gets a little bit messy because it changes. With the Greek pantheon, we have Poseidon, the god of waters, and then we have Mercury, the god of wisdom. In Semitic, we have Kothar, which my guess is the root of the word catharsis, god of invention and the arts. But similarly, we have Yam, which is analogous to Poseidon, the god of the seas, the god of the ocean. And in Mesopotamia, we have Enki and Ea. So all of these different hierarchies, all the same archetypes are made, they just change names. So it seems as though there was one original inspiration of which we could say was Mesopotamia and Sumer, but that would be a little oversimplifying. So we're going to dive into El, and this is a very tricky topic because El simply means deity. So when you're reading these old texts, whether in Arabic, Ugaric, Phoenician, or Hebrew, El means deity. So you're not always sure if they're referring to the El or a El, if that makes sense. So when going through these old texts, and specifically the first iterations of the Bible, we are unsure what exactly is being referenced. And I'll give you a flavor of how complex this gets. So El moves to El Eltan, and then moves to Olam, or El Shaddai, or El Sebaoth, or El Du Yahweh Sebaoth, or Yahweh Elohim. So we see how through time the verbiage changes with different characteristics in each verbiage. But in all of these, since we're moving all the way from El to Yahweh Elohim, is this the same El, the El of the Canaanites, or is this thought to be another god? This is where the confusion comes from. So El is the Father God. Essentially, it plays that trope that gives life to all things. It is the Creator God. Yahweh in Ugaric texts, which, mind you, Ugaric just means, it's like Leviathan, which means that it was more of the north, like Lebanon, than it would be of the south, like Iran. They said in their text that Yahweh, or the God of the Old Testament, was the son of El. Now, this would seem heretical to say, but we're talking history at this point. Another key distinction I want to put here ahead of time too is that the difference between paganism and what would become Judaic Abrahamic monotheism is that in paganism, the gods have a sexual life. They are sexual beings. They kind of have almost orgiastic and strangely incestuous relationships, whereas Yahweh, as it would become, is essentially sexless. There are no, God doesn't have a wife. That's made very clear by the canon of Abrahamic religions. However, in this time, Yahweh did have a consort, as they called it, and that was Asherah, which we'll talk about her soon. Another word for El, or a different God, we're not sure if this is the same God, is Elyon, and this means the Most High God. This is Hebrew. So Elyon could be a different god of the Canaanite pantheon, or it could be another form of El. Some say that it's the son of El, and then there are others that contradict this. And mind you, this will all kind of make more sense as we keep going along. These are the kind of building blocks that I had to give out to reach understanding here. So Elyon denotes the highest or uppermost. Another one that we might see is Elohim, as I mentioned, and Eloah being the singular version. We would just get rid of all these additions in Hebrew to eventually just say Yahweh, but it's all just to say that it's very interdependent. El translates to Yahweh. Now, we should spend some time too discussing how El has affected our language, being even English, and to say Babel, Babel, Babylon, is Bab-El. the gateway of God, or the highest one, Babel. And to spend some time on that too, there's been arguments that Babel comes from, the sound of babbling, which would be the confusion of all the languages diversifying there, or how a baby always, its first words technically are always ba 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 babble. So there's a lot of meaning to take out of this word in particular. When we say illumination, or to become illuminated, meaning the light, elum, elum, elum is the same word for the Godhead of the Canaanites, Elohim. To them, it would have more meant to be strong than it would have meant light at this time. And Israel does come from El. He who strives with God is the etymology of Israel. So some other names I have to put out there is when they would refer to El, sometimes they would refer to him as Abu Shamana, which is the father of years, or Abu Adamai, the father of man, Adam, or they would call him Father Bull. So again, if you go back to the Mithras talks, the concept of the god of time being slayed by Mithras, that god of time would have been El, the father bull, El being depicted as a bull. They also similarly would call him Tore I, or bull, the bull god. And another would be the Bantyu Binwati, which is the creature of creatures. So, you got a lot of nicknames in this polytheism as well. But just, it's curious to dissect. Again, we have to bring up this bull worship aspect of the ancient past. So we're going to get away from El right now, which we'll have to discuss later because he's a big part of this whole story. And talk about Asherah. This is the mother goddess. So similarly, Kronos and Gaia were the original Titans, the great father and the great mother. And this is the same case. In the Canaanite tradition, there was El and Asherah. And I also mentioned that Asherah was apparently the consort of Yahweh, whether we believe El is Yahweh or someone or another god is Yahweh. So Asherah is associated with sex, justice, political power, and war. This is synonymous, give or take, with the Egyptian Isis, or the Sumerian goddess Inanna, or the Persian Ishtar, or Esther. And this word, Asherah, is the root of where English, moving through Greek, would eventually get the word star, Asherah, star, because Asherah was associated with the evening star, the goddess of the evening star. Is that Venus? Venus being, Aphrodite, yada, yada. Dissect that as much as you want. She was also known as she who walks upon the sea. So she's the top god, or the top goddess. And there was a lot of reverence for her within the Canaanites. They would build what are called Asherah poles, which there are these big wooden pillars, oftentimes stylized trees that were symbolic for the tree of life, which might have some implications with Kabbalah, but that's a whole nother subject. These poles were erected all around, I guess we can call it the Middle East. However, when the time comes, Christianity will want to destroy these old monuments, and we can find this in the Bible. We can find it in Exodus 34:13. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. Similar taste is like what you find in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Um, you know, Continuing to say to destroy these poles. So that's the reference. If you read across the Bible and you find Asherah poles, it's a specific reference to it trying to distance itself from its Canaanite origins. Asherah was the birthing mother of 70 or 77 or 88 different gods. This is all unclear depending on what text you're translating. So, as I was sort of mentioning, the Canaanite religion fell under what would be considered pagan worship. So, in the same way, as our Zoroastrian talk, even though Zoroastrianism was very much a part of Christianity and Judaism's beginning, it distanced itself immediately. We see the same thing here with the Canaanites. It's kind of like forsaking its fathers or its lineage, so in a certain way. Of course, by the Christian interpretation, Asherah, God and Asherah being together is a heathen. It's heretical. It's viewed as a perversion of truth, that God does not have a wife. So this is something that Judaism would do away with, aside from the Kabbalah. In the Kabbalah, that's mysticism. That's a different story. There is a god and a goddess in Kabbalah, but we're not going there right now. We will eventually, though. There's a hint for the future. So this is one that I really want to talk about. And it's not Baal. It's not Baal. We'll get to that, though. He's a big character. But I want to talk about Moloch, or Moloch, which this is really interesting because it seems to have more implications in the modern day. Moloch appears as an old man with ram's horns and a scythe. And he gets mentions in the Old Testament. And it's never a good thing. This would be the god that they accuse of sacrificing children to. And this is an evil sun god. Their concept of the sun god was evil. So this is something I want to spend some time on too, because Baal is the god of storms. So they're living in the desert. So of course Baal would be a big deal for them, because they'd want that god to favor them so that they could get rain, so that they could eat, so that they could drink. Whereas Moloch, the god of the sun god for them would have been a terrible god, because that would have been the heat, that dries everything out. And so they would have thought as the sun as something more negative in their particular culture. So we have to be mindful of why certain things are evil and certain things aren't, depending on what pagans we're talking about. So, where do I even want to begin with this? Moloch has gone by several names. I think Topeth, and no, that's not it. What I want to bring up is the cremation of care ceremony, where they discovered in the Grove of California the elites performing ritualistic sacrifice, or pretending to perform ritualistic sacrifice under a giant statue of an owl. And I think it was, I'm forgetting his name right now. You all know the guy who recorded this and, became what he is today. But he was claiming that they were worshiping Moloch. But Moloch was never depicted as an owl. The only god that was really depicted of an owl, especially the ones that I can find, there might be more, but that's Minerva, and that's a Roman goddess, which was a goddess of music, poetry, wisdom, commerce, medicine, crafts. This would have been like worshiping creativity and wisdom and knowledge. So, but if in that way, they claim, the people who perform the cremation of care claim that they are doing a play. So it makes sense that they're worshiping Minerva. And you can find this owl logo for the National Press Club. If you look up the National Press Club, those who run the higher echelons of the media of this country, their logo is an owl. And if you look at the $1 bill, in the one that is up in the right corner, if you look very closely, even if you can get a magnifying glass, there is a little owl up there. So there's some subliminal Freemasonry stuff there that we have to mention. But the mention of them making a sacrifice, if they are actually doing this in the cremation of care at the Bohemian Grove, Moloch would be the guy, especially if we're going to say that the elites are very, malevolent and coercive people. Then this would be the god of capitalism, which I want to spend some time on. So they would definitely want to worship Moloch. That makes a lot of sense. But again, the owl doesn't quite fit the case. So before I get to Ginsburg, Moloch is Saturn, and Saturn is always astrologically and in many religions associated with very negative things. It is the controller of the celestial wheel, sacrifice, death. Saturn would eventually cognate into Satan. So all that is bad, to those that would worship Saturn in the ancient past, that always seemed to be of bad news. I think in Sumerian, this is Nergal, which had its own cults, which is a fascinating topic I'd like to get into at some point. But Ginsburg wrote a poem. Allen Ginsberg wrote a poem on Moloch, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's actually pretty vulgar. It's not that I'm not willing to be vulgar, but it's actually also very long. But I want to kind of establish the air as Moloch is understood. So I'm going to quote some of it. Moloch, filth, ugliness, ash cans, and unobtainable dollars. Children screaming under the stairways, boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks. Moloch, the heavy judger of men, the incomprehensible prison, the crossbones, soulless jailhouse, and the Congress of sorrows. Moloch, whose buildings are judgment, the vast stone of war. Moloch, the stunned governments. Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery, whose blood is running money, whose fingers are 10 armies, whose ear is a smoking tomb. Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. Moloch, whose skyscrapers stand long streets like endless Jehovah's. Moloch, whose factories dream and croak into the fog. Moloch, whose smokestacks and antennae crown the cities. Moloch, love is the endless oil and stone. Moloch, whose soul is electricity and banks. Need this be any more clear that Ginsburg very much believes that Moloch is the oppressor side of the matrix of the world, the unforgivable absurdity and inhumanity that we see in the modern day that we relate to, and that has always been here. For Ginsburg, this was the blind force and maliciousness of the exploitation that mankind has become trapped in. So Moloch is a bad dude. So very reasonably, he would be made into one of the higher figures of demonology in Christianity. Him would be reasonable. All these other gods will also become demons in Christianity, but we'll explain that. So when you think of Moloch, in any references that you might ever see, I think he gets some names in some TV shows too. You got to think of the very worst part of humanity, the exploitation, and sacrificing children to Moloch, if that was true in the ancient past, would have been viewed as a means of satiating his bloodlust so that others wouldn't die. To show respect to that evil would be a way of sparing some of the suffering that he is sure to bring. Okay, Baal. This is a big one. Baal is going to be a big part of Christianity and a big part of paganism to come. This is not an evil god. This is actually the hero god of the ancient past. This is the god of storms, or the cloud monster. So god of rain and storms. And again, that's why the Canaanites made Baal the biggest deal in their pantheon. There is Zeus. This is what would eventually become like Zeus for the Greeks. So aside from being a hero, his wife was Anath, which is the goddess of fertility and sexuality, which we'll get to a little bit later. He enjoyed the top spot of the pantheon, being worshipped well beyond the Canaan. And Baal simply means Lord. So this word is also confusing. El meant deity, Baal means Lord. So when it comes to what Christianity and Judaism will eventually do, it's hard to say that Yahweh is just El, and it's hard to say that it's just Baal. It's kind of as though they mixed the two together to make like the mega god. Which, something before I forget that I want to mention, there's verses in the early Bible of them refuting Baal worshippers. And by basically saying, all right, you guys will all pray for rain to Baal or Baal. Some people call him Baal. And we'll pray to our God that it won't rain. And so this is how they would like show whose God is true. It's like a God competition, like making your dads fight sort of a situation. That's how it was, or at least how it's quoted in the early Bible. And the story as it's told by them, of course, is that, rain doesn't come. So, Jehovah is the winner. But anyway, I'm going to move on from that. So, of course, eventually Baal's reputation would become completely damaged. And we'll give more of the hero stuff here in a second, but it would be damaged because, again, they would claim that offerings would be made to them, sacrifices would be made to Baal, that they were all leading the wrong path, so to speak. They would try to completely erase this past. And by doing this, they actually took the form of the word Baal and moved it a few steps down the line, which would eventually become Beelzebub, which, again, is one of the highest demons in the demonology under the devil. So directly we see Baal would become a demon under Satan by the name Beelzebub. So they're not just, these demons are actually the gods of the polytheistic past, which I think is an interesting realization to make. That's the power of the press, though. We don't remember the story as it was. We remember as it's been passed down through history. So you could blame Baal or Beelzebub for all the terrible things that are happening today, thanks to how history's been passing down. So there's this thing called the Chaos Kampf, and this is how many religions rip off one another. And Baal had this dispute with the sea god Yam, and also had disputes with the god of death, which would be we'll get to that in a bit. But one of Yam, or the sea gods, or Poseidon's monsters, was the Leviathan. This was in Canaanite, the name is Lotan, which is a 7-headed, fire-breathing, like crocodile-looking sea monster, which would directly get ripped off by the Old Testament, with God slaying Leviathan with his shining sword and so forth. However, this was originally passed down via Baal. Baal was the one that killed Lotan. So that is one of many stories throughout all religions that tell this tale. One that I haven't mentioned on this talk, but I've mentioned a few times around, is that here in Wenatchee in central Washington, there is a tale of how Saddle Rock was formed. And that was a trans-elemental serpent that the Wenatchee had a story of, that was slain by who they refer to as the twins, and its body would fall and create peaks around the Wenatchee Valley, and its spine would fall into the lake in Chelan and become a sort of mythic sea monster that people still know about today. So this story of the serpent goes a lot further than just Baal and Lotan. And when we see the story of Leviathan, you can't think of it as more of where it's coming from. There is an original story that all of these old religions, including all the way in Native America, would use. There's a trope there. That's what's referred to as the chaos Kampf. Okay, I got a little sidetracked there, but I want to do some quotes that show where Baal is coming from in the Bible, at least. So Jeremiah 19:5 says that Baal requires human sacrifice of the firstborn, and that the priest of Baal in rites of wild abandon scream loud ecstatic cries and injure themselves. So they make them seem like they're just so insane. That's coming from Kings. So God directly confronted paganism through his prophet Elijah. And that's where we got that competition. Hey, is your God going to make rain, or is my God going to not make rain? And so this is where we get a lot of this demonizing material, is in Kings and in Jeremiah. There was no response and no one answered because no one paid attention when they worshipped Baal. In Matthew 12:27, Jesus calls Satan Beelzebub, linking the devil to Baal Zebub, the Philistine deity. The Baalim of the Old Testament was more like a couple of demons masquerading as gods, the Baalim, and all of the idolatry that's ultimately said to be devil worship, and you can find that in Corinthians. So that's just setting up the case of all the kind of slanderous stuff as it would be understood in history. But to the Canaanites, Baal is the real deal. Baal was their Zeus. So if you want to think of it in this way, Zeus is Beelzebub. That's how this works, according to how it's been co-opted by Christianity. Now, I mentioned Anath, and I'm not going to speak of her long, but that was the wife of Baal, and the goddess of war, depicted wielding an arrow. To the Egyptians, this god would be Anat, from Anath to Anat. And we would eventually find something similar in the Greeks with Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. But in Canaanite, Anath was a lot more vicious. So here's just a quote from the Ugaritic scripture. She smites the people of the seashore, destroys mankind on the sunrise. She piles up heads on her back. She ties up hands in her bundle. Anath gluts her liver with laughter. Her heart is filled with joy. So while I'm making the case that that there was some co-opting of the Canaanites to make them look far worse, I have to also say that these myths are rather savage, and they are rather vulgar and crude. But this isn't uncharacteristic in the ancient past. This is how paganism worked. This is how they talked about these things. Another god that we have to mention, all of these gods that I'm mentioning too, by the way, you can find in the Old Testament. All of this is a reference to the Old Testament. I'm not talking about the gods that a part of the Canaanite pantheon that aren't part of the Old Testament. That's how I'm keeping this talk a reasonable amount of time. But the other god that we have to mention is Dagon, and this is the god of agriculture, inventor of the plow. This was the chief deity of the Philistines. So instead of Baal, it was Dagon to the Philistines. Dagon was the father of Baal. He was also the fish god. Dag in Hebrew means fish. So he's depicted as a half fish, half man creature. Dagon would also be an inspiration for H.P. Lovecraft's like Monsterverse. Basically, he would use the name Dagon directly, rip off the Canaanites. Dagon was the god of the primal waters, the provider of grain. So to the Philistines, who had more of an agricultural basis, it makes sense that Dagon would be their big deal, that they would want to praise Dagon. The fact that it's a fish god, I think, has a few interesting implications, most notably the fish crowns that the pulpit or the Pope and the bishops wear. I know there's the association with Pisces, which is another thing, but there could be a root here with Dagon being this fish entity as well. The idea is that we eventually stemmed from fish. That was a part of the historic story of the Canaanites, which would stand the test of time, as they say in science, is that, you know, eventually, like a long time ago, we were fish, and then one fish turned into a mud skipper, and then that mud skipper hung out on land long enough, and all the mammals came, and yada yada yada. So maybe they were on with something about Dagon being a fish. So you get a mention of Dagon in Judges, where we are told that Dagon was the god of the Philistines, that he offered a great sacrifice, that the Philistines offered a great sacrifice to Dagon, believing that their idol had delivered Samson into their hands. So there's this kind of contentious story that goes on. And in Chronicles, it mentions Temple of Dagon, of which the head of King Saul was fastened. And in Samuel 1:5, Dagon is brought to humiliation by the true God of the Israelites. So in all these strange references of the past, you see how the Old Testament is this story that's basically destroying all the Canaanite gods. They're basically made this one God to destroy all the others. So it's as though Old Testament is like a story of polytheism being defeated by one of its own. And to claim that it's a monotheistic doctrine is not really accurate, because it's referencing all these other gods, but we'll get to that in a bit too. So Dagon was actually the real deal for Hammurabi, King Hammurabi of Babylon, which, as some of you may know, Hammurabi would be the one to create Hammurabi's code. Everybody might know of the saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is the first instance of what you might consider law in the ancient past, and also is tied to why Rastafarians are so negatively associating Babylon and speaking so poorly of Babylon, because this is with this law, this act of creating law, and also with Moloch being this element of capitalism that we see today. Both of these aspects would have been coming from Babylon and would have eventually been viewed as the perversion of the whole earth, that it all started with the Canaanites and Babylon and these particular gods. But anyhow, Mot is Hades, or Mot is the Canaanite god of death. It is the favorite son of El, and the enemy of Baal. So here we have the case that the god of death is enemies with the god of storms. So there's in the Canaanite myth, these two will always fight with each other. One of them dies, and then they get brought back. So let's go through some of this verbiage here. The word mot, mortal, mortality, perhaps coming from mot. Maltese say mute. Syriac says mata. Death is also an Akkadian muti, which would come from Mot. So you can see when we say the Phoenicians too, we have to understand that a lot of our writing and a lot of our vernacular comes from phonetics, which is a direct reference to the Phoenicians. So when we speak of these old gods, we have to realize that a lot of our words are paying homage to these old gods. There's a lot to say on that topic. Yeah, I don't want to get into that. As I mentioned somewhat before, Mot is in Sumer what would have been called Nergal. So I haven't mentioned too often the Sumerians in this, which they are an inspiration. But the reason I've stuck with the Canaanites here is because the Sumerian references are not necessarily found in the Old Testament. It's all about the Canaanites when it comes to the Old Testament and the Phoenicians. The only references to Sumerian gods are maybe the instances of the giants and apparently the mention of the Anunnaki, which I am not going to get into that subject here. That's a whole nother thing. But the difference, what I want to talk about here is the worship of the gods in Canaanite times seemed of symbolic. Like they would worship the rain because they needed the rain, and they thought that the sun was evil because the sun was their detriment where they lived. Whereas there's a lot of arguments that the Sumerians believed that these gods were actually incarnate or physical beings. It was a lot more literal. And of course, there's all the people who speak of like Nibiru and Zechariah Sitchin's interpretations of them, to the point where they believe that these old gods are either human alien hybrids or actual extraterrestrials. But you don't find this in the Canaanite religion. And that's why it's not a big topic when we're talking about all this. They did inspire a lot of these concepts of the Canaanites, but I can't really say much more than that. Also, they did inspire this whole chaos comp myth that I was talking about before. It was Marduk versus Tiamat in their religion, and also in Babylonia. So where do I want to leave off with this? Okay. Oh, before I get off the topic, I want to talk about Babylonia, just as a side note, or Babylon, or Babel, the Tower of Babel. This is what got me started on this whole subject, but honestly, it's very difficult to talk about what was really happening in Babylon because of, again, that we're getting all of our word from the Christian and Judaic concepts. Or history written, as opposed to the actual history itself. I mentioned before that Babel has also, in verbiage and etymology, meant to confuse. So the name might have been changed from what it actually was. The Tower of Babel was a temple to Marduk, and again, Marduk was their Baal, their chief king deity. So as it's told, God disrupted the work of building the Tower of Marduk by confusing the language of the workers so that they could no longer understand each other, and that the city was never completed. So that's as far as that really goes. It's just to say that, yet again, this act of God in the past that destroyed what was being done by the polytheists is an intentional one. It's co-opting the past and making it work with the new idea of your God, if you can understand where I'm coming from with this. And this also would be why the Gnostics would completely disregard the Old Testament as a completely separate God than the God that they worshipped in the New Testament. And why we also see such a characteristic difference between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. That the Old Testament was basically trying to kill the dogs of the past. They were trying to appropriate history through the Leviathan myth, or through talking about how all these other gods become demons, and the New Testament was kind of just using all of that destruction and building off of the settled water, so to speak. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go through some scripture again. I don't like doing this, but it has to be straight from the word of the book. Exodus 6:2-3. God says to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as the Almighty, God Almighty, or as it's originally written, El Shaddai. But by my name, the Lord, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So here's the distinction here. The distinction between the God as declared as El Shaddai and the God Yahweh. So this is confusing if you take the literal translations. What God are we talking about? Are we talking about different gods here? Deuteronomy 32:7-9. Remember the days of old, consider the generations of long past. Ask your father and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you. The Most High, El Elyon, which I mentioned before, gave the nations their inheritance when we set up the boundaries for the peoples according to the number of sons of God, El, for the Lord's Yahweh, for the Lord's Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. So in that line alone, we get three different references that seem to be different gods in a certain way, or different names of one god, or how should we understand this based off of the Canaanite history, right? Psalms 89:6-10. For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? This is a reference to gods or Baals. O Lord God Almighty, who is like you? You are the mighty, O Lord, and your faithfulness surrounds you. Your rule over the surging sea, and when its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab, which is Leviathan, or another form of Lotan, like the one you slayed with the strong arm. You scattered it amongst your enemies. See how convoluted this is? Psalms 89:6 in Hebrew. For who in the skies compares to Yahweh? Who can be likened to Yahweh among the sons of God? And these are gods, which are Elims. So another reference to the fact of there being other gods. I'm going to cut out some of these because honestly, I hate quoting the Old Testament too often. But you see my point here is that it's the verbiage of what is God and what is Yahweh, El Elim, Jehovah, Eloah, Elyon, El Elyon. These can be what? The Lord of the New Testament, or speaking of other lords, or this is the argument that I want to make from all this. Is it so coercive to say that perhaps this all is a worshiping of the old Canaanite El, or the old Canaanite Yahweh, and that actually Christianity or early Judaism is built on just making the worship of one Canaanite polytheistic entity as opposed to something else entirely? If you can start to imagine how the Canaanites would have interpreted what was done with their pantheon in the Old Testament, how would they have felt about that? There's a lot of arguments here. The old pharaoh Akhenaten in 1353 BC, just about, tried to make a monotheistic religion out of the polytheism of Egypt, centered around Aten, or the disk of the sun, the god, the aspect of Ra. This is what is referred to as Atenism. He tried to make monotheism work, but after his death, his temples were destroyed and the whole idea of Atenism was basically done away with. and his name was left off the list of the pharaohs. So this happened before the Old Testament, and even before Zoroastrianism really came about. So I kind of retconned myself here and said that Zoroastrianism had a lot to do with the birth of monotheism. But the truth is that Akhenaten was one of the first to try it, and he failed. And that this thing called Pantheism, which is the basically where you have polytheism, but there is one big boy that everybody worships. That was very common in paganism, but to try to get rid of all of the rest of them was something that was never really done. Like I said, Zoroastrianism had Mithras as one of its gods, but it did still make uh, one god supreme. So in this way, this is how we can finally get around to the point that I want to make, that Judaism was the first one to get rid of all of the rest. It was the first time in history, after many attempts, to make it all about one ruler. So why, though? I mean, this move is very politically motivated. It's also very historically motivated. We can't just say that it's spiritually motivated. As I hope that this talk has been making clear, this was very much a cultural move, the Old Testament. And as to why, we can only really speculate. I've heard it claimed that monotheism supports monarchy, the idea that to have one lordship would subliminally make it easier for the greater people to worship one ruler or one tyrant or one dictator, and this would have served the kings. And this can be backed up when talking about who was at the Temple of Nisai, who was putting together the Bible, who was writing it actually, and to what ends. Was it something that was coercive in order to achieve a means? Was it for domination? And you could back this up by seeing what the church became later, how it was this ruling force that got rid of everything around it, all forms of paganism, all other forms of Christianity that didn't like, how it became so vicious in this. And so it makes sense that you could say that Judaism in this form and in the mainstream form and later Christianity were concocted to appropriate dissonance and to appropriate all the various beliefs so that one thing could be ruled with or ruled under. And we also have to keep in mind too that back in this time, religion is synonymous with politics. The rules of a nation have everything to do, or the laws of a nation have everything to do with its religious structure. So in order to change the laws, you had to change the religion in a real sort of way. So this can help kind of contextualize where Christianity is coming from a different perspective. And mind you, this is definitely a more negative perspective. But at the very least, we have to be able to say that it does seem a bit much what was done with the Canaanites to deceive its ancestry and to not kind of, it's one thing to not mention it, but it's another thing to completely subvert it. And that the origins of Judaism are the same as the origins of the Greek pantheon. I think that's a very interesting statement to take away from history, that this is the root. So although Mesopotamia and Sumer have a great influence on civilization as a whole, what really would become the religion and society as we know it can be in another way more accredited to the Canaanites and their polytheism. We still see references to these gods, whether in the demonology of Christianity or pop culture. there is an argument here that the secret societies of the past that would move to the Vatican, that would move into the Knights of Templar, that would form the international banks of Switzerland, that would form the Illuminati the same year as America, that would form that would create blood feuds and wars over dominance in the Civil War, and would create the Federal Reserve, and that all of this was perpetuated through a secret society that has always worshipped Canaanite polytheism or Moloch or Baal. So there are people who claim that all of this subversion of the world, and again, the cremation of care, is rooted in Baal worship. They call it the Baal cult or Baal cult. And I don't want to go completely there. I'm not saying that it is true. I'm not saying that it's not true. But you will find a lot of Canaanite symbology in elite depictions and iconography and symbolism of the Freemasons. There is a claim to say that those in the higher eschaton, all the way up to the 33rd degree in the international lodges, are Canaanite worshippers, that these black masses are rooted in Moloch or in Satanism. And I don't claim to know that. I've never been there. They never invite me. But before I get too off the topic, the one last theme that I want to put out here is, I said in the beginning, this is the bridge between animism and modern day monotheism. And I hope this has been made very clear that in animism, they eventually started to come up with certain concepts of certain phenomena of the world, started ascribing a character to the sun, started ascribing a character to the weather. When they would see lightning flash, they would think that the gods were fighting inside of the clouds. They would think, they would start to personify and tell stories of the entities as they would come up with them. And their objective proof for these phenomena were what the gods would do. When the sun would do this, when it would go away, when it would come back, that was like a personality. When the clouds would be dark, that was a personality. And when they would spew lightning, that's another personality characteristic. So you can see how polytheism has formed around the natural world, but starts to become a sort of reverence, that they start to do things like sacrifices, and that it starts to become so much more serious. And eventually, through it becoming more categorical, it would kind of implode on itself and birth out monotheism, for reasons that we can't necessarily discuss, other than maybe political, maybe historical, maybe it has to do with the truth. Maybe it was all about, Zoroaster, all these monks coming down with visionary experiences of one beatific entity overall, and that all of them are essentially nothing. It's very convoluted. And I have to say too, that this is probably one of the hardest research subjects I've done so far. It is definitely the least straightforward, because this is such a messy point in history, and it hasn't survived, except for if you want to claim that it survived in secret societies, which they're pretty tight-lipped. So it's hard to say the implications. It's hard to say the interpretations of the past. And aside from a few choice statements, we can't really say too much about if they were good or if they were evil. The one thing that we can say is that this is very influential. This is a big part of how the religion that we know today as the common religion of Abrahamic religions came to be. This is their ancestry, and this is our link to the ancient past. So with that, I will finally shut up. Okay.